10 years, a life of gilded luxury, bought with her silence and sustained by his arrogance. Evelyn Hope sacrificed her career for a man who repaid her loyalty with public humiliation and a vicious divorce, leaving her with a pittance and a cruel laugh. Andrew Sterling thought he had successfully relegated his ex-wife to obscurity, a footnote in his brilliant career. But he forgot one thing. You don't bury a genius. You simply plant a seed. Get ready for the shocking true story of how Evelyn went from crying on a dusty apartment floor to becoming the billionaire CEO who bought out her ex-husband's entire crumbling empire. This is the ultimate checkmate. The air in the penthouse was always the same, chilled to a precise 68 degrees and scented with a faint, sterile aroma of white orchids and lemon oil. It was the smell of money, Evelyn Hope used to think. The kind of wealth so vast it scrubs the world of any real human scent. Her life was a masterpiece of curated perfection, and she was its most prized and most imprisoned object. Tonight was the annual Sterling Capital Foundation Gala. Andrew, her husband, was being honored. He was always being honored for something. He moved through the world like a conquering king, his charisma a weapon and his ambition a relentless force. He was handsome, sharp, and utterly ruthless, qualities the financial world adored. "Evelyn, darling, the Cartier necklace, not the pearls," Andrew said without looking up from his phone, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. "The pearls make you look maternal. We're projecting power tonight." Evelyn stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in their cavernous dressing room. The woman staring back at her was dressed in a shimmering silver gown by a designer whose name she couldn't recall. Andrew's stylist had picked it out. Her hair was swept into an intricate knot by a stylist Andrew had booked. She looked beautiful, expensive, and completely alien to herself. She swapped the pearls her grandmother had left her for the cold, heavy diamond necklace. It felt like a collar. "Better?" she asked, her voice a little hollow. "Much," he said, finally glancing at her. His eyes did a quick professional appraisal, the way he might assess a stock portfolio. "Perfect. Now remember tonight, when Mr. Nakamura from Mitsubishi is there, you just smile. Don't talk about your little projects." Her little projects were the only things that felt real. In a forgotten corner of their sprawling apartment, she had a small office filled with textbooks, schematics, and journals. Her background was in environmental engineering, a degree she'd earned with honors before Andrew's career had exploded and her own had been quietly extinguished. She was working on a design for a new type of biodegradable battery, one that could store solar energy with unprecedented efficiency. To Andrew, it was a silly, non-profitable hobby. "It's not just a little project, Andrew," she said softly, a familiar flicker of defiance rising in her chest. "The designs for the polymer matrix are showing real promise. It could be revolutionary." He finally pocketed his phone and walked over to her, placing his hands on her bare shoulders. His touch was proprietary, not affectionate. "Darling, you are married to the CEO of Sterling Capital. We don't save the world with dirt and plants. We move markets. We build empires. Let me handle the revolutionary ideas, all right? Your job is to be my beautiful, supportive wife, and you do it so well." He kissed her cheek, a cold, dry gesture, and left the room. The gala was a glittering, suffocating affair at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Men in bespoke tuxedos talked in low, urgent tones about acquisitions and leveraged buyouts. Women with surgically perfected faces and jewels that could fund a small country exchanged air kisses and veiled insults. Evelyn played her part, smiling graciously, her hand resting on Andrew's arm. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life. It was during Andrew's speech that she saw it. He was at the podium, a vision of power and success, thanking his brilliant team and his gorgeous, endlessly supportive wife, Evelyn. As the room applauded, his eyes scanned the crowd, not for her, but for someone else. Evelyn followed his gaze. It landed on a young woman standing near the bar, Isabella Rossi. She was the daughter of a rival hedge fund manager, impossibly beautiful in a blood-red dress, her expression a mixture of adoration and triumphant possession. Andrew gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a shared secret in a room full of people. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't just a look. It was the 100 other small things that suddenly clicked into place. The late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls he'd take on the terrace, the scent of a different perfume on his suit jacket one night that he'd brushed off as someone from the office. The drive home was suffocatingly silent. The lights of Manhattan blurred past the tinted windows of the Maybach, but Evelyn saw none of it. All she could see was that look. Back in the cold, sterile penthouse, Andrew loosened his bow tie. Well, that went perfectly. Nakamura was practically eating out of my hand. I think we'll have the deal closed by Friday. Evelyn didn't move from the doorway. Who is she, Andrew? He froze, his back to her. Who is who? What are you talking about? The woman in the red dress, Isabella Rossi. The name felt like acid on her tongue. The way you looked at her. He turned around slowly, and for the first time in a long time, the charming mask was gone. His expression was cold, hard, and annoyed. Don't be ridiculous, Evelyn. You're being hysterical. Don't you dare call me hysterical, she shot back, her voice trembling with a rage she hadn't felt in years. I am your wife. I am not a fool. How long has it been going on? Andrew sighed, a theatrical, put-upon sound. He walked to the bar, poured himself a glass of scotch, and took a long swallow before facing her. A year, maybe a little more. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. A year of lies, of feeling like she was going crazy, of believing she wasn't enough. A year, she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a deep, chilling cold. She understands me, Andrew said, his voice devoid of any apology. She understands my world. She's ambitious, exciting. She isn't content to stay at home playing with batteries. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just admitting to his betrayal. He was using her own dreams to justify it. He was telling her that everything she was, at her very core, was the reason he'd sought comfort elsewhere. I gave up my career for you, she said, her voice cracking. I supported you, hosted your dinners, charmed your clients. I built this life with you. I built this life, he corrected her, gesturing around the opulent room. I paid for all of this. And let's be honest, you were never going to be some world-changing scientist. You were a B-plus student at a state university. I gave you a world you could never have dreamed of. Tears streamed down her face now, hot and shameful. She had cried for him before, out of loneliness, out of frustration. But this was different. This was the cry of a soul shattering. He just watched her, his expression bored. We can get through this if you're smart about it. We can maintain appearances. Nothing has to change. But my relationship with Isabella is not up for discussion. He was offering her a continuation of her life in the gilded cage. Only now she would be fully aware of the bars. She would be the compliant wife, knowing she was sharing her husband with another woman. The humiliation was a physical thing, clawing at her throat. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had built her world around, and saw a complete stranger, a cruel, hollow stranger. And in that moment, something inside her, something that had been dormant for a decade, snapped. No, she said, her voice shaking but clear. No, it's over. Andrew actually laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. Over? Evelyn, don't be a fool. You have nothing. You are nothing without me. You walk out that door, and you walk into oblivion. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You want to fight? I will bury you. I'll drag you through a divorce so brutal you won't have the strength to stand. You'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. Is that what you want? She met his cold, dark eyes, and through her tears, she found a sliver of strength. I want my life back, she whispered, even if there's nothing left of it. He stared at her for a long moment, then shrugged. Fine, have it your way, but don't come crying to me when you're stocking shelves to pay rent. He turned his back on her, dismissing her as easily as he would an underperforming asset. Call your lawyer, or don't, it won't matter. Evelyn stood alone in the vast, silent living room, the Cartier diamonds cold against her skin. He was right. She had no money of her own, no recent work experience, no powerful connections. She had only a broken heart and a head full of ideas he considered a joke. And as the reality of his threat settled in, the tears of heartbreak turned into tears of pure, terrifying fear. The first meeting with her lawyer was a brutal awakening. She'd chosen a small, independent firm, one recommended by an old college friend. The lawyer, a kind but pragmatic woman named Sarah Chen, laid out the grim reality. Andrew's lawyers are from Sullivan and Cromwell, Sarah said, her pen tapping a thick file with Andrew's name on it. They're sharks, Evelyn. Their opening move is to claim your prenuptial agreement is ironclad. The prenup? Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. She'd signed it a week before their wedding, a blushing 24-year-old so in love she would have signed anything. Andrew had called it a formality, a way to protect the small family inheritance he had at the time. He claims it entitles you to a one-time payment of $50,000 and nothing more, Sarah continued gently. He's arguing that Sterling Capital was built entirely during the marriage. Yes, but through his unique and extraordinary efforts, and that you had no part in its success. They're painting you as a decorative housewife who contributed nothing of financial value. Nothing? Evelyn's voice was a shocked whisper. I ran our homes. I managed the staff. I hosted dozens of events a year that were crucial for his networking. I edited his speeches. I helped him prep for meetings. I was his partner. I know, Sarah said, her eyes full of sympathy. And we will fight that. But you need to be prepared. They are going to tear you apart. They will scrutinize every penny you ever spent. They'll subpoena your friends, your family. They will try to prove you were nothing more than a glorified personal assistant. The war had begun. Just as Andrew promised, it was brutal. Within a week, her credit cards were canceled. The access to their joint accounts vanished. She was locked out of the penthouse, her belongings packed into sterile boxes by a moving company and sent to a storage unit. An itemized list coldly emailed to her by Andrew's assistant. The depositions were the worst part. She sat for hours in a soulless conference room, flanked by Sarah as Andrew's lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Robert Davenport, dissected her life with surgical precision. Mrs. Hope, Davenport began, his voice condescendingly smooth, can you describe your professional activities during your 10-year marriage to Mr. Sterling? I managed our households in New York and the Hamptons and our flat in London. I oversaw renovations, managed budgets, and a staff of 12. So you were a domestic manager, he interrupted. A job for which many people are paid a modest salary. Did you receive a salary? Of course not. I was his wife. Indeed. Now let's talk about your expenditures. This receipt from Chanel for $12,000 on June 4th. Was that a business expense? It was a gown for the hospital charity benefit that Andrew's company sponsored. He insisted I wear it. So he provided you with a clothing allowance, generous, and this $5,000 charge at a spa? Was that for Mr. Sterling's benefit? On and on it went. Every vacation, every piece of jewelry, every dinner was twisted from a part of their shared life into a lavish gift bestowed upon a kept woman. They painted a portrait of her as a vapid, spendthrift socialite who did nothing but squander her husband's hard-earned money. Andrew's friends and colleagues, people who had smiled at her and praised her charm at parties, provided affidavits that supported his narrative. She was lovely, but had no head for business. She was sweet, but seemed uninterested in his work. The final devastating blow came when they brought up her little projects. Davenport produced copies of her college transcripts. A Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering from Penn State. Commendable. But you never pursued a master's, did you? Never published any papers? Never even held a job in the field? I was planning to, she said, her hands trembling under the table. But Andrew's career was taking off. We decided together that I would support him. Ah, he decided, Davenport said with a cruel smile. And these notebooks filled with what you call designs, have any of these resulted in a patent, a prototype, any form of intellectual property with tangible market value? It's a work in progress, she mumbled, the humiliation burning her cheeks. A work in progress, he repeated, letting the words hang in the air like an epitaph for her ambition. Just like your career. Andrew was never at the depositions. He floated above the messy, ugly proceedings, insulated by his wealth and power. But his presence was everywhere, in the cold precision of his lawyers, in the calculated cruelty of their strategy. He wasn't just divorcing her, he was systematically dismantling her identity, erasing her contribution to their life together, and ensuring she was left with nothing to rebuild with. The final court date was a blur. The judge, swayed by the mountain of evidence presented by Andrew's team in the ironclad language of the prenup, delivered the verdict. The prenup was upheld. Her contributions were deemed non-financial and adequately compensated by the lifestyle she enjoyed. She was awarded the $50,000 plus an additional $100,000 in a goodwill gesture from Andrew. A gesture designed not out of kindness, but to make him look magnanimous in the press. $150,000. After a decade of marriage to a man whose net worth was approaching $1 billion. It was a joke. It was an insult. It was oblivion. She saw him as she was leaving the courthouse, swarmed by reporters. He was with Isabella, who was clinging to his arm, looking radiant and victorious. He caught Evelyn's eye over the cameras. There was no remorse in his gaze, no sadness. There was only the cold, flat look of a successful transaction. He had won. He had buried her. Sarah walked her to a taxi, her hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "I am so sorry, Evelyn. We did everything we could." Evelyn couldn't speak. She numbly got into the cab, the address to her new life, a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a less than glamorous part of Brooklyn, on her lips. As the taxi pulled away, she looked back at the courthouse steps. Andrew was smiling for the cameras, his arm around his new life. The city that had once felt like her kingdom now felt like a foreign land, hostile and immense. The shattering was complete. She was no longer Mrs. Evelyn Sterling, the wife of a titan. She was just Evelyn Hope, a 34-year-old woman with $150,000, a storage unit full of ghosts, and a future that was a terrifying, empty void. The first month was a study in freefall. The tiny Brooklyn apartment was a world away from the silent, air-conditioned perfection of the penthouse. Here the sounds of the city were a constant companion. The wail of sirens, the rumble of the subway beneath the floorboards, the shouting from the street below. The air was thick with the smells of exhaust fumes and fried food. For the first week, Evelyn did little more than move from the lumpy mattress on the floor to the cracked window, staring out at a world that no longer had a place for her. The name Sterling had been a key that opened every door. Now the name Hope meant nothing. Simple tasks became monumental hurdles. Trying to rent the apartment, the landlord had looked at her lack of employment history and recent credit reports, marred by Andrew's cancellations, with deep suspicion. She'd had to pay 6 months' rent up front, a significant chunk of her meager settlement. Her former friends, the wives of Andrew's colleagues and partners, had vanished. Her calls went to voicemail, her texts were left unread. She was a social pariah, a casualty of a war they had no interest in joining. To them, she was no longer an asset. She was a reminder of what could happen if the gilded cage was ever rattled. One rainy Tuesday, she hit what she thought was the bottom. Her coffee maker had died, and the simple desire for a decent cup of coffee drove her out of the apartment. She walked into a small cafe, her clothes a relic of her past life, a cashmere sweater that now felt absurdly out of place. As she waited in line, she overheard 2 women behind her, their voices hushed but audible. "Oh my God, look, that's Evelyn Sterling, Andrew Sterling's ex-wife. Wow, she looks rough. I read about the divorce in the Post. He left her with practically nothing. Can you blame him? He's with Isabella Rossi now. She's a much better fit, ambitious, smart." The implication was clear. Evelyn was neither. She was the discarded, dowdy first wife. The shame was so intense it felt like a physical illness. She fled the cafe without ordering, her cheeks burning, and ran back to her apartment, where she collapsed onto the mattress and finally let out the raw, ugly sobs she had been holding back for weeks. She cried for the life she had lost, for the love she thought she had, for the woman she used to be. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen shut. When the tears finally subsided, they left behind a hollow emptiness. Andrew had not just taken her money and her home, he had taken her sense of self. His narrative of her, the useless, decorative wife, had seeped into her own soul. She was starting to believe it. Days turned into a monotonous blur of cheap takeout and sleepless nights. The money in her bank account was a dwindling resource, a constant ticking clock reminding her of her precarity. She started looking for jobs, entry-level administrative positions, retail work, anything. But the 10-year gap in her resume was a chasm she couldn't explain. In one interview for an office manager position, the interviewer had looked at her resume and said, "It says here you managed a staff of 12, but this was domestic staff?" His tone made it sound like she'd been managing house cats. She didn't get the job. The true bottom came a few weeks later. She was down to her last $20,000 in her checking account, the rest tied up in a term deposit she didn't want to break. A bill for her storage unit arrived. It was $300 a month to keep the ghosts of her former life locked away in a climate-controlled box. She couldn't afford it. She took the subway to the facility, a sterile, soulless building on the industrial outskirts of Queens. The manager, a bored-looking man, led her to Unit 3B. When he rolled up the metal door, her past life hit her like a physical wave. There it was, the designer clothes in their garment bags, the custom furniture too large for her new apartment, the boxes of fine china she'd spent months selecting, and in the back, behind a stack of art books, were several heavy-duty plastic tubs. Her office, her little projects. She spent the next 8 hours sorting through the wreckage of her marriage. She created 3 piles. The first was to sell, the jewelry except her grandmother's pearls, the designer handbags, the art. The second was to donate, the clothes, the furniture, the kitchenware. The third, the smallest pile, was to keep. It contained a few photo albums, her grandmother's pearls, and the plastic tubs from her office. As she knelt on the cold concrete floor, prying open the lid of the first tub, the smell of old paper and ink filled the air. Inside were her notebooks, her textbooks, her schematics. Her fingers, dusty and sore, traced the equations and diagrams she had drawn. Here was the design for the biodegradable polymer matrix. Here were her notes on increasing the charge density of organic electrodes. Flipping through the pages, she wasn't Mrs. Sterling, the failed wife. She was Evelyn Hope, the engineer, the woman who had graduated 3rd in her class, the woman who had once dreamed of changing the world. Andrew's mocking voice echoed in her head. "You were never going to be some world-changing scientist. You were a B-plus student." Rage, cold and pure, surged through her. It was a different kind of anger than the hurt and betrayal she'd felt before. This was a clarifying fire. He hadn't just divorced her. He had tried to erase her. He had tried to convince her, and the world, that she was nothing, that her mind, her ambitions, her very essence were worthless. She sat there on the floor of that dusty storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was no longer hers. She looked at the notebooks in her hands. This was all she had left. This was the only part of her that Andrew had never been able to touch, only mock. Right there, at rock bottom, a decision formed. It wasn't a grand cinematic moment. It was a quiet, steely resolve that settled deep in her bones. He thought this was a joke. He thought she was nothing. Fine. She would show him. She would show them all. She closed the notebook, her knuckles white. She would not be a tragic footnote in the story of Andrew Sterling. She would be the author of her own story, and it would be a bestseller. She took her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, and for the first time in months, she wasn't searching for jobs. She was searching for patent lawyers in lab space. The free fall was over. The climb was about to begin. The first step was survival. Evelyn sold everything of value from the storage unit. A discreet consignment shop took the designer bags and jewelry, giving her a check that felt like a lifeline. It added another $80,000 to her war chest. It wasn't much in the world of tech startups, but it was everything to her. Her days transformed. Her small apartment became a war room. The walls were covered in whiteboards filled with chemical equations and business models. The floor was littered with textbooks and research papers. She lived on coffee and instant noodles, channeling every ounce of her energy and every dollar she had into one singular goal: bringing her battery to life. She filed a provisional patent for her core concept, a fully biodegradable, high-capacity, solid-state battery using a sugarcane-based polymer. It was the culmination of years of her hobby. Now it was her entire world. The next hurdle was funding. The $80,000 was seed money, but she needed lab equipment, materials, and eventually a team. She wrote a meticulous business plan, her nights spent learning about venture capital, seed rounds, and market projections. Then came the rejections. She pitched her idea to over 30 angel investors and small venture capital firms. The meetings were a gauntlet of condescending skepticism. Most of them were men who saw a 34-year-old woman with a 10-year resume gap in a green idea. "It's a lovely concept, Mrs. Hope," one told her, "but the energy sector is a brutal space. You need a killer instinct." "The science seems ambitious," said another, his eyes glazing over as she tried to explain the polymer matrix. "Perhaps you should partner with a more experienced technical co-founder." They met a man. Each rejection was a fresh sting, a reminder of the world's N. Andrews' low expectations for her. But with each no, her resolve hardened. She refined her pitch, sharpened her data, and learned to counter their biases with irrefutable science. Her last-ditch effort was a name she'd found in an old tech journal: Benjamin Carter. Carter was a legend in Silicon Valley, a gruff, reclusive genius who had founded and sold 2 major semiconductor companies before retiring in his 50s. He was known for his brilliant engineering mind and his absolute intolerance for corporate nonsense. He was also known for being impossible to reach. She spent a week crafting a single email. It wasn't a plea, it was a challenge. She laid out the core science of her battery, attached her patent application, and ended with a single line: "The biggest breakthroughs are often dismissed as hobbies. I believe this is one of them. I can prove it." She didn't expect a reply. A week went by, then 2. She was about to give up when a one-line email appeared in her inbox. The sender was simply BC. "You have 20 minutes, my office. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., don't be late." Benjamin Carter's office was a sprawling workshop in an unmarked building in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, filled with lathes, 3D printers, and oscilloscopes. Carter himself was a man in his late 60s with a shock of white hair, calloused hands, and eyes that seemed to see right through her. He didn't offer her a seat. "All right, Hope," he grunted, holding up her printed-out email. "You got my attention. Now explain to me why this isn't just another eco-fantasy." For 20 minutes, Evelyn spoke without interruption. She didn't give a business pitch. She gave a science lecture. She walked him through the chemistry, the potential for scalability, the cost-effectiveness of the materials. She filled his whiteboard with diagrams and equations, her passion overriding her nerves. When she finished, breathless, he was silent for a long time, staring at the board. He walked over, picked up an eraser, and wiped away one of her equations. He scribbled a new one. "Your ion transfer rate is theoretical," he said, not looking at her. "You haven't accounted for polymer degradation under high-load cycling. This model will fail after 500 cycles." Evelyn's heart sank. He'd found a flaw. I'm working on a stabilizing compound." "Use a graphene lattice," he said gruffly. "Infuse it into the polymer during the curing stage. It'll reinforce the structure and triple the conductivity. Your cycle life will go from 500 to 5,000. Evelyn stared at him, stunned. In 30 seconds, he had not only understood her life's work, but had also seen how to make it 10 times better. He wasn't dismissing her. He was collaborating. He finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "This is either the most brilliant thing I've seen in a decade, or you're a very convincing fraud. There's only one way to find out." He walked to a dusty desk and pulled out a checkbook. "I'm giving you $250,000. It's not a gift. It's a seed investment. I get 20% of your company. I want a working prototype on this bench in 6 months. A prototype that meets the specs we just discussed. You'll rent a corner of this workshop. You can use my tools. Now get out of my office and get to work." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. Not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude and relief. Someone believed her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Carter grumbled, turning his back to her and picking up a soldering iron. "Just don't make me regret it." Evelyn walked out of the Navy Yard and into the bright sunlight, clutching the check in her hand. She had a mentor, she had a lab, she had a chance. She named her fledgling company Viridian Dynamics, Viridian for the green future she envisioned, and Dynamics for the unstoppable force she was determined to become. The Phoenix was no longer just a spark. It was beginning to catch fire. The next 2 years were a blur of relentless, grueling work. Evelyn practically lived in her corner of Benjamin Carter's workshop. She was the first one in every morning and the last one out, often sleeping on a cot she'd set up next to a milling machine. Her world shrank to the size of a circuit board. Her focus narrowed to the atomic structure of a polymer. Ben was a demanding, cantankerous mentor. He pushed her, challenged her, and tore apart her work with brutal honesty. But he also taught her. He showed her how to streamline her manufacturing process, how to negotiate with suppliers, and how to think not just like a scientist, but like an engineer and a CEO. With Ben's guidance and her own unwavering dedication, Viridian Dynamics hit its milestones. The first prototype, a small, ugly block of greenish polymer hooked up to a voltmeter, not only worked, it exceeded their projections. The graphene-infused lattice was a game-changer. The battery was lightweight, completely non-toxic, and held a charge longer than any comparable lithium-ion cell. That prototype, in Ben Carter's name, was enough to get them in the door for a Series A funding round. Evelyn, no longer the timid woman who stammered through her pitches, walked into boardrooms with a quiet, unshakable confidence. She knew her science inside and out. She knew the market. She knew her company's worth. They secured $20 million from a top-tier Silicon Valley firm that specialized in disruptive technologies. With the new capital, everything accelerated. Viridian Dynamics moved out of the workshop and into its own dedicated facility, a sleek research and manufacturing plant in Long Island City. Evelyn hired her first team, bright, hungry, young engineers and scientists who were drawn to her vision. She built a company culture based on innovation and respect, the polar opposite of the cutthroat, ego-driven world of Sterling Capital. News of Viridian Dynamics began to ripple through the tech and energy sectors. TechCrunch ran a feature on them. The sugar battery. Could Viridian Dynamics end our reliance on lithium? Forbes named Evelyn one of its 30 under 40 innovators to watch. She was 36, but they made an exception. The articles always mentioned her past, framing it as a Cinderella story, from Park Avenue socialite to clean tech CEO. Evelyn hated that angle, but she knew it was a hook. What mattered was that they were talking about her company, not her divorce. In Manhattan, Andrew Sterling heard the buzz. At first, he dismissed it. Evelyn's little project? He laughed to a colleague over lunch at a Michelin star restaurant. It's a fluke. Some old man is propping her up. It's a feel-good story for the press, nothing more. It will be bankrupt within a year. He was busy with his own empire. He had successfully orchestrated a merger, was living with Isabella in their gleaming penthouse, and his face was a regular fixture on financial news networks. He never imagined that Evelyn's world and his would ever seriously intersect again. But Viridian's ascent continued. They landed their first major contract, a pilot program with a leading solar panel manufacturer to use their batteries for residential energy storage. Then came a bigger deal, a partnership with a major European automaker to develop Viridian batteries for their next generation of electric vehicles. The technology was proving to be not just viable, but revolutionary. It was cheaper, more ethical to produce than cobalt-reliant batteries, and significantly more stable. Evelyn was no longer just a CEO, she was becoming a visionary. She gave a TED Talk that went viral, speaking with eloquence and passion about a future powered by sustainable technology. She was no longer the woman in the borrowed silver dress, smiling silently beside her husband. She was a force in her own right, dressed in a sharp, minimalist suit, her voice clear and steady, her ideas shaping an entire industry. The transformation was total. The fear and insecurity that had plagued her were gone, burned away in the crucible of creation. She was confident, decisive, and respected. She hadn't sought revenge on Andrew. She had simply become too big for revenge to matter. Her focus was on her company, her team, her mission. But the world of high finance is small. As Viridian's valuation soared past the nine-figure mark and started heading towards 10, Andrew could no longer ignore it. His dismissal turned to annoyance, then to a simmering resentment. At a dinner party, a banker friend clapped him on the shoulder and said, "My God, Andrew, did you see Viridian's latest valuation? Your ex-wife is going to be a billionaire. Who knew she had it in her? You must have one hell of an NDA in that divorce settlement." Andrew's smile was tight, his eyes cold. The idea that the woman he had discarded as worthless was building an empire on a silly hobby was not just an insult. It was a threat to his own narrative, to his perception of himself as the sole architect of success in their relationship. He started following Viridian's progress obsessively, his jealousy curdling into a dark, proprietary anger. This woman, this company, this success, it should have been his. In his twisted logic, he had created her through his rejection. He had forged her in the fire of their divorce. Therefore, her success belonged, at least in part, to him. And if he couldn't own it, he would destroy it. He called an emergency meeting with the head of his firm's trading desk. "I want you to pull every piece of opposition research you can find on Viridian Dynamics," he commanded. "Find their weaknesses. I want to be ready." The collision course was set. Evelyn was ascending, focused on the bright future she was building. Andrew was watching from his tower of pride, sharpening his knives, waiting for the perfect moment to bring her crashing back down to earth. The day Viridian Dynamics announced its initial public offering, IPO, was a major event on Wall Street. The company was the darling of the clean tech world, a rare unicorn with a proven product, massive contracts, and a charismatic female founder. The initial pricing valued the company at an astonishing $8 billion. On paper, Evelyn's majority stake would make her a multi-billionaire overnight. The financial world was buzzing. In the studios of CNBC, the morning anchors were discussing the imminent opening bell. Their star guest for the segment was Andrew Sterling. "Andrew, you're the king of market analysis," the host began. "Viridian Dynamics. Hype or the real deal?" Andrew smiled his trademark predator's smile. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was his stage. "It's a great story," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "A very compelling narrative. But when you look at the fundamentals, the story falls apart. The technology is unproven at scale, the supply chain is fragile, and frankly, the leadership is inexperienced in the cutthroat global energy market. It's overvalued. A classic bubble." He leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. "In fact, Sterling Capital is so confident in our analysis that we are taking a significant short position against Viridian. We believe the stock will be trading at less than half its IPO price within 6 months. It's a smart play for sensible investors." It was a declaration of war. A powerful Wall Street firm publicly announcing it was betting on a company's failure on the morning of its IPO was a brutal, almost unprecedented move designed to spook the market and trigger a sell-off. It was a move born not of financial analysis, but of pure, venomous spite. In the Viridian Dynamics boardroom, Evelyn and her team watched the broadcast on a large screen. A nervous silence fell over the room. Ben Carter, standing beside her, let out a low curse. "That arrogant son of a bitch," Ben muttered. "He's trying to sink you before you even leave the harbor." Evelyn's face was calm, her expression unreadable. Inside, her heart was pounding. This wasn't business. It was personal. This was Andrew trying once again to tell her and the world that she was worthless. She looked around at her team, the bright, dedicated people who had poured their lives into this company. She looked at Ben, who had believed in her when no one else would. She would not let him win. "He's wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "His analysis is based on old data and personal bias. He has no idea what we're about to announce." The opening bell rang. The stock symbol VDN appeared on the screen. For the first few minutes, Andrew's strategy seemed to be working. The stock dipped, dropping 5% below its opening price as nervous investors reacted to his pronouncement. Andrew, watching from his own office, allowed himself a triumphant smirk. Then at 9:45 a.m., a pre-planned press release hit the wire. Viridian Dynamics announces exclusive 10-year partnership with Toyota for global EV battery supply. and landmark deal with the U.S. Department of Defense for Advanced Energy Storage Solutions. She had held back her two biggest deals, waiting for this exact moment. They were blockbuster announcements validating her technology at the highest levels of global industry and government. The effect on the market was instantaneous and explosive. VDN's stock didn't just recover, it launched. It surged 20%, then 40%, then 60%. Trading was briefly halted due to the volatility. When it resumed, the climb continued. By midday, Viridian's stock price had more than doubled, and its market capitalization soared past $20 billion. For a short seller, this kind of meteoric rise is a death sentence. Every dollar the stock went up was a dollar lost. Andrew watched the ticker on his screen, his face draining of color. The numbers were bleeding red. Millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. His traders were calling him in a panic. "We have to cover! The losses are catastrophic!" To cover their short position, they had to buy back the stock they had borrowed. But now they had to buy it at the new insanely inflated price, pouring gasoline on the fire and driving the price even higher. It was a classic short squeeze, and Andrew Sterling was caught in the jaws of the trap. By the closing bell, Sterling Capital had lost over $1.8 billion. It was one of the single worst trading days for any major firm in a decade. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Andrew's investors were furious. The board demanded an emergency meeting. The financial press, which had once lauded him as a genius, turned on him, calling his move against Viridian a reckless, emotionally driven catastrophe. His personal life crumbled just as quickly. Isabella Rossi, who had attached herself to his power and wealth, saw the writing on the wall. She watched him that evening, a man she barely recognized, pale and shaking with a rage that had consumed him. She saw a loser. Within a week, she had quietly packed her bags and moved out of the penthouse, leaving nothing but a short note. She was already being seen with another, older, and now significantly richer, billionaire. Andrew was alone, his firm on the brink of collapse, his reputation in tatters, his lover gone. He had tried to bury Evelyn Hope, but he had only succeeded in digging his own grave. And from across the city, in the gleaming new headquarters of Viridian Dynamics, Evelyn watched. She felt no joy, no triumphant glee, just a quiet, steely sense of justice. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely, irrevocably flipped. The weeks that followed the IPO were a slow-motion demolition of Andrew Sterling's world. The catastrophic losses from the short position triggered a crisis of confidence in his firm. Clients pulled their funds, partners demanded answers, and regulators launched an investigation into potential market manipulation. Sterling Capital was hemorrhaging money and credibility. The empire Andrew had built with such ruthless precision was crumbling into dust. Layoffs began, then a desperate attempt to sell off assets. But the damage was too severe. The firm was toxic. No one wanted to touch it. Bankruptcy wasn't just a possibility, it was an inevitability. Evelyn, meanwhile, was on the cover of Time magazine. The headline read, "The Green Titan, How Evelyn Hope Reinvented Energy and Rewrote the Rules of Power." Her company was a global phenomenon, and she was its revered leader. She was a titan now, in the way Andrew had always claimed to be. One crisp autumn morning, 2 months after the IPO, Evelyn sat in her minimalist corner office overlooking the East River. Her assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Ms. Hope, the board of Sterling Capital is here." "Send them in," she said calmly. 4 gray-faced men in expensive suits walked into her office. They were the remnants of Andrew's board, men who had once looked through her at galas and cocktail parties. Today they looked at her with a mixture of terror and awe. "Ms. Hope," their leader began, his voice strained, "thank you for seeing us. As you know, Sterling Capital is in a precarious position. We are facing liquidation." "I'm aware," Evelyn said, her voice even. She gestured for them to sit. They did, perching nervously on the edges of their chairs. "We are here to make a proposal, a plea, really," the man continued. "We believe the firm's core asset management division is still viable. It needs a massive capital infusion and a complete restructuring. We are looking for an acquirer." Evelyn listened patiently, her hands steepled on her polished concrete desk. She knew exactly what they were saying. They had come to the only person with the capital, the market power, and, they hoped, the motivation to save them. "And you're proposing that Viridian Dynamics acquire Sterling Capital?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "Yes," the man said, looking down at his hands. "It would be a strategic acquisition, a foothold in the financial sector for your rapidly expanding enterprise." Evelyn was silent for a full minute, letting them sweat. She thought of the cold conference room where their lawyers had torn her life apart. She thought of Andrew's sneering face on television, so confident in her failure. "Viridian has no strategic interest in asset management," she said finally, her words hitting them like stones. "Your business model is based on propping up the very fossil fuel industries my company is making obsolete. Your firm is a relic." The men paled. Their last hope was evaporating. "However," Evelyn continued, her voice softening slightly, "I am interested in one thing. The building. This one, in fact." She nodded towards the window in the direction of the gleaming skyscraper that housed Sterling Capital. "And the name. There is a certain branding potential." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto the lead board member. "Here is my offer. Viridian will acquire the entirety of Sterling Capital's assets and liabilities for the symbolic price of $1. We will absorb what is salvageable and liquidate the rest. We will prevent a chaotic bankruptcy that would wipe you all out completely. In return, I want full, unconditional control, effective immediately." It wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. They had no choice. They agreed to everything. The next day, Evelyn rode the private elevator up to the top floor of the Sterling Capital building, the place where Andrew had ruled, the place she had never been welcome. The grand, mahogany-paneled boardroom was empty, save for one person. Andrew stood by the vast window, looking out over the city that had once been his. He looked older, diminished. His suit seemed to hang off his frame. He turned as she entered. His face was a mask of disbelief and raw, undiluted hatred. "You did this," he hissed. "You did all of this just to destroy me." Evelyn walked slowly towards the head of the massive boardroom table, his table, and placed her briefcase on it. "You're giving me too much credit, Andrew. I didn't do any of this for you. I did it for me. You were just a catalyst, an obstacle." "You came here to gloat," he spat, "to see me like this." "No," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I came here because this is my boardroom now, and you are trespassing." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a single file. She slid it across the polished table towards him. "This is a severance agreement. It's the standard package for redundant senior executives whose positions have been eliminated due to acquisition." He stared at the file, refusing to touch it. "I'm also prepared to offer you a job," she said. A flicker of something, hope, disbelief, crossed his face. "A job?" "Yes, we're restructuring. We'll need a junior analyst in the archives division. It's a basement office. The pay is $60,000 a year. You'd be responsible for boxing old files for liquidation. It's a 6-month contract." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the offer struck him dumb. She was offering him the same amount of money he'd left her with, plus $10,000 to perform a menial, humiliating task in the ruins of his own empire. It wasn't revenge. It was a perfectly balanced, karmic equation. He stared at her, his jaw working, searching for a scathing retort, a final ounce of defiance. But there was nothing. She held all the power. He was the one who was nothing. He had created his own oblivion. "Get out," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "As you wish," Evelyn said. She turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. Her heels clicked decisively on the marble floor. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice desperate. She paused at the door but didn't turn around. "Why?" he asked, his voice broken. "I don't understand. You were just my wife." Evelyn stood for a long moment, her back to him. Then she gave him her final answer, the truth that had taken her years of pain and struggle to forge. "No, Andrew," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the vast empty room. "You were just my husband." And with that, she walked out, closing the door on her past. She stepped into the hallway, into her building, into her future, a future she had built not from the ashes of her old life, but from the brilliant, unbreakable materials of her own soul. She was Evelyn Hope, the woman everyone was talking about, and she was finally completely free. And that is where our story ends. Not with an ending, but with a powerful new beginning. Evelyn's journey teaches us that the most profound transformations often rise from our deepest wounds. She reminds us that our worth is never defined by who we are to someone else, but by who we have the courage to become for ourselves. The world may try to put you in a box, to label you, to tell you what you can and cannot be. But like Evelyn, you hold the blueprints to your own potential. Her ex-husband saw a housewife. The world saw a visionary. What matters is what you see in yourself. If this story of resilience, justice, and incredible triumph resonated with you, please don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their potential is limitless, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that empower and inspire. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to light. Thank you for listening.